Hey everyone, this week we're sharing with you an episode that we know you'll find fascinating. It's on the double empathy problem, which talks about how many neurodivergent people are misunderstood and how people around them, family members, educators, and other professionals, can work to overcome these barriers to support neurodivergent people. This is an episode of the Limited Series podcast hosted by Amanda Morin and me. Amanda and I co-authored the book Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported. Check out the Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools podcast everywhere you listen. Hey everyone, I'm Emily Kircher-Morris.
And I'm Amanda Morin, and we've got a lot to say today. And what's really funny is Emily is watching me. You can't see me as we're doing this, but Emily is watching me because we're recording both audio and video. And Emily is probably knows what I'm going to say next. And it's really interesting because she knows where I'm going to mess up. She knows where I'm going to say the right things, right? It's really interesting. You know, we talked a little bit on one of the first episodes about how we met and how we started doing this project together. But what we really didn't talk to people about is like how similar we are and how we discovered that over time. And how there are ways where we can have conversations, and I know exactly what you're saying, even though you don't know what you're saying, or you know what I'm trying to say when I don't know what I'm trying to say. And it's one of the things that I love about this sort of partnership is because I feel so comfortable with you. I can mess up in front of you. I can be my best self in front of you. We have conversations about things that, you know, like, congratulations on your new washer and dryer kind of conversations, right?
Yeah, well, and I think it all aligns with this idea of empathy and how important it is for everybody to feel like they are heard and understood. And I know for us specifically, when we first met on Twitter, it was conversations just about our background, you know, raising kids, the fact that I think we both married different versions of the same person, you know, in many ways. And Dave and John, Dave's sitting here doing the editing, and John is providing all of the music for the episodes. And it's great to be able to have that sense of someone who kind of gets where you're going with things. And even when we don't always agree, because writing a book together
it's not easy.
I've been a co-author on a book before as well, which was a wonderful experience. But also I would say that our experience was also different just because, first of all, that was a revision of a book. Mm-hmm. This was something from scratch. But we really had to hammer out some things.
Yeah.
And kind of reconcile areas that we didn't always see the same way. But I think we could always take that time to find the ways to do some perspective taking and figure out what was really important. It was intentional though, but we would often state it explicitly to say how we were processing through that.
We would also even ask each other, you know, tell me your thinking on this. Mm-hmm. Tell me why this makes sense to you this way. And I think that's something we don't always do with our students, right? We're not always having those conversations, which is sort of why we wanted to have this conversation today, where we're going to start talking about, you know, what does it feel like when you actually really understand where your students are coming from? You know how you have those things that stick with you from when you were a kid?
Yes.
And they come back up over and over again? Mm-hmm. I remember so clearly, I had this experience in third grade, right? I am way past third grade in my lifetime, right? But it still sticks with me. And I think this is part of being a neurodivergent learner, right? So I had this experience where I was in my third grade class and kids were going up to sharpen their pencils. And those old-fashioned pencil sharpeners, you know, the crank pencil sharpeners. If you've never seen one, they used to have like a cover on them that would capture the pencil shavings, right? And kids would love to take the cover off, so the pencil shavings would just go flying everywhere. My teacher at the time, that had happened, and all these students were going up to sharpen their pencils, and she was really upset that was happening. I really needed to sharpen my pencil. I wasn't going to be able to do my work. And so in my mind, I just had this, I have to go sharpen my pencil. And I wasn't paying attention to how upset this teacher was about the way students were using it. I didn't know how to put that cover back on the pencil sharpener. I just didn't know how to do it. And I went up to sharpen my pencil, and the teacher just exploded at me, like really, really angry. What are you doing? I just told everybody else you can't do that. And my answer was, but my pencil needs to be sharpened, right? Like to me, that was so clear cut. I needed a sharpened pencil. This was the pencil sharpener I had. I was going to use it, and then I was going to walk back to my desk and I was going to do my work. But the teacher, no matter what I said, the teacher was like, but I told you not to do that. We're not doing that. You should have done this. And I just remember getting so upset that I wasn't being heard, that she couldn't understand what was happening inside my brain. And I don't know why, but to this day, I get like upset thinking about that. I think we're fine now. My pencil sharpener is different over time, but those are the things that stick with our students. When we are not listening to their perspectives, when we are not understanding where they are coming from, 40 years later, that sticks with me, which is mind-boggling.
When I think about that from a counseling perspective too, and thinking about being neurodiversity affirming, what I can imagine was happening for you at that time, and I hope it's okay, I might disclose a little bit of something that I know a little bit about you.
Sure.
With just some of those thoughts that either can be intrusive or it's like, I have to sharpen this pencil. I have to sharpen this pencil.
Yeah.
And not being able to probably move forward with your work until that pencil was sharpened. And also not understanding the implications when the teacher said that they didn't want anybody using the pencil sharpener, you probably interpreted that as the kids who are messing around and doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, that's not my intent. I'm not going to go mess around with it or disrupt the class or, just using it as an excuse to get out of my seat, whatever it might be. But the teacher just didn't even take a minute to kind of check what their experience was in that moment. And then, this really stuck with you. It influenced you significantly. And that's really what we're talking about with the double empathy problem. Like, I can also understand from that teacher perspective, why that can be so frustrating.
Yeah.
I was in the classroom. I know what that feels like to have those little things that kind of can trigger us, but we have to kind of be aware of that and recognize, especially for our neurodivergent learners, that their experience might be different than what we're expecting. And so on today's episode, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about what's called the double empathy problem. We'll define that, talk a little bit more about it, and then figure out ways that we can use it to provide those neurodiversity affirming environments for our students. So hang with us.
So when I first began teaching, I realized how much I didn't learn in my teacher prep program about how to understand and support the students in my classroom, right? So behavior management was a big gap in my knowledge, and I turned to the methods I saw around me with other teachers, but it was clear that not all of my students were thriving under that one-size-fits-all approaches that myself and my colleagues were using. And those are the same practices that I didn't thrive under when I was a student. As I broadened my knowledge base and started working with more students and the families of students with learning disabilities, and then became a parent to neurodivergent children of my own, it became so clear to me that the environments and practices that we provide to all learners didn't give them what they needed to thrive. Emily and I are committed to helping make schools create the change we need to create neurodiversity-affirming environments that don't rely on one-size-fits-all methods and that remove the barriers that stand in the way of success for neurodivergent learners. And to support that, we do educator trainings. We work with school districts, we work with them virtually, and we work with them in person. So if you would like to learn more about bringing Emily or myself to your school district through virtual means or through in-person means to support changing the way you look at learners and the behavior management systems you use, head to neurodiversity-affirming-schools.com or click in the link in the show notes to find out more.
So let's start off our conversation by defining the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem was actually something that was first written about and suggested by Damian Milton, and he wrote this article in 2012. And what he really talked about was how in society we have this inclination to talk specifically to autistic people, but I think we can broaden that to neurodivergent people in general. But especially with autistic individuals, there's this idea that they don't experience empathy or they don't act on empathy or that they struggle with empathy. I'm not going to get into that part of the conversation.
There's a lot there.
We can recognize that that's not accurate, but
yeah,
that's not this part of the conversation. The problem with that assumption, though, is that often the conversations that happen, especially as teachers, is we will often go to our autistic students and say things like, You need to have more empathy. You need to do more perspective taking. You need to be more flexible with your thinking. You need to find other solutions to things. And in the process of doing so, we, as the educators, are not being empathetic or using perspective taking or being flexible in what our expectations are. And we're not taking into account the needs of those neurodivergent students, which might really vary from the other students in our classes or our own. So the double empathy problem recognizes that empathy really is a two-way street, and that it shouldn't always be just one person or one group's responsibility to always be the ones adapting to the majority of the group.
Well, it's interesting too, because even in that wording, you need to, right? Like I always think a lot about that. You need to, you should, you have to. It doesn't even take into account the fact that our autistic, our neurodivergent students have things that they also need, that they want. I've had a couple of conversations with students lately about the difference between I need to say this and I would like you to listen, right? There's a difference there. And so when people, some of the students I work with, and frankly, my own children to some degree who are also ADHD or autistic, they say, I need to tell you this. I need you to hear this. And I'm trying to teach them the difference between I need you to and I want to share this with you. Are you willing to listen? And I think that's the piece that we miss as educators sometimes is the being willing to listen and being willing to see that there's an entirely different perspective and way of thinking on the part of our neurodivergent students that is valid and is really, if we can start paying attention to it, I don't know, it opens up my mind in so many ways when I can see the different way a student's approaching a problem, approaching a situation or that kind of a thing. One of the things to me, Emily, that stands out about when we talk about empathy is that I don't think we're always making a distinction between empathy and sympathy. And I think oftentimes when we are talking about autistic student communication or neurodivergent student communication, there's this sort of, like pity that goes with it. This feeling of, I wish they really could see it. I wish they could understand. I wish they could communicate like the other students. I think of a particular student that I'm working with right now who's having this experience of being in a classroom where a teacher is trying to draw the student into the conversation on a regular basis. And the student keeps saying to me, I'm fine. I don't actually want to discuss anything. If I do, I'll raise my hand. I'll join the discussion. But this teacher knows that the student is autistic. She happens to be twice exceptional autistic. So she's doing great in the class. She's doing all of her work. She's, but she doesn't want to participate in the conversation unless she feels like she has something to offer. But the teacher is continually saying to her, what do you think? What's your thoughts? Did that change how you think about something? And it's funny because when the student tells me about this, that's the tone of voice that she uses. And so I hear in that this teacher probably is well-intentioned in trying to draw my student into the conversation, but it's really uncomfortable for that student who has said, I will participate when I feel like I have something to say, and doesn't know how to say that in any other way.
I think also what it reminds me of is so many of these situations where we're really just not taking into account the various needs of those neurodivergent kids. So it reminds me of a story of a client that I worked with. And so this student was early high school, maybe a freshman, and he was autistic and ADHD. And he walked into his science class one day and all the seats had been moved. They were in like a horseshoe shape. And as we know, a lot of autistic kids sometimes struggle with unexpected change, with that problem solving in those types of social situations. Like, what do? I don't know what to do here. And so the way that he solved this problem was he went and took one of the chairs and moved it to where his chair normally goes and sat down. The teacher entered the classroom, and rather than talking to the student, investigating a little bit, simply demanded, you need to move your chair back. Put the chair back where I had it. And the student said, this is where I sit. True facts.
Yeah.
Like not incorrect.
Yeah.
What ended up happening was this escalated and ultimately led to a meltdown for this particular student. And, they ended up in the principal's office. And ultimately, when I look back at that, and it's like, I'm in this counseling session, I'm processing all of this. And I'm like, okay, well, this poor kid.
Yeah.
Because if anyone had ever just taken this time, first of all, the day before, to say, hey, you know what? Tomorrow we're going to be watching a video in class. Your seats are going to be rearranged. This is what they're going to look like. And then you can choose any seat that you like, or even just for maybe that student, perhaps. This is going to be your seat. I'll put something on it to make sure no one else sits there, or something like that. Maybe even doing a practice run, right? So tomorrow the chairs are going to look like this. Let's move our chairs like that. Everyone kind of figure out where you're going to sit. So that way tomorrow when you come in, it's actually good for all students. I mean, it actually helps with that transition that next day into the classroom. But even in the moment in that day, that teacher could have asked those questions and said, well, tell me why you moved your chair over here. If you just give that moment to say, you're right, that is where your chair goes. I moved these seats this way because we're going to be doing a different activity today. And I thought that this arrangement of seats would be better. I mean, he didn't really care about where he was sitting. He just didn't know how to solve that problem. And no one gave him a clear explanation for why it happened the way that it did.
And what I hear in that solution, right? We talk a lot about the double empathy problem, and we're not talking as much about a double empathy solution, right? And when you're talking about what could have happened, I'm hearing sort of a solution, which I kind of like because I think that's the next step, right? But what I'm hearing is curiosity. And that's such a part of how do we move past this double empathy problem is just being curious, just asking the questions, not making assumptions, thinking through that there is another perspective here that you may not be seeing, right? I think I have often said to students, and this has not been my best move, early in my career, I've said, I can't see into your brain. I don't know what you're thinking. I mean, I haven't said it in that tone of voice, right? But essentially that's what I've said is like, I don't know what you're thinking if you don't tell me what you're thinking. But I don't think that I ever thought when I was beginning my teaching career to say, can you explain to me what's happening right now, right? There's a big difference between saying, can you explain to me? Can you tell me more? I'd like to understand, than just sort of jumping to a conclusion and making an assumption and then moving based on that assumption. And I think for so many of our neurodivergent students, they just need the chance for us to ask those curious questions, to be able to understand the perspective, and not assume that they're doing something disruptive, that they're doing it on purpose.
And you mentioned that the assumption that they're doing something disruptive. So many of our neurodivergent students have a reputation for getting emotionally dysregulated, for blowing up. And what I have found in my work is that when you give the benefit of the doubt and assume that there's just some sort of miscommunication, that there's some sort of piece that's missing, you're able to find that solution.
Yeah.
Trying to ask just some very non-judgmental questions, looking for clarity. You mentioned, asking them to explain their thinking. You're right. A lot of times for neurodivergent kids, that's really hard. And so we might need to ask some really explicit questions about things. In my office, a lot of times I work a lot with more on the family side of things in that environment. And so I'll have parents come in and they're talking about some sort of situation that's been going on with their child. And they're like, I keep telling them they need to do X, Y, Z, and they're not doing it. And so then I'm like, okay. So I'm then talking to the child, the parents aren't in the room, and we just start talking through it. And I kind of go down these different levels. And it's like, well, so tell me about that. Okay, well, then tell me about this. Okay, so tell me about the next thing. And eventually we get to this point where then I'm able to offer an explanation for something that they didn't understand. And I cannot tell you how many times these kids look at me and they go, no one ever explained it to me that way before.
Right.
And if we're just really explicit about things and clear about things, and we keep going back to this point, but it's not just good for our neurodivergent kids, it's good for all kids. When we take away the need to make assumptions or infer what somebody is meaning, it helps everybody have a clear understanding and come to a common ground with whatever the situation might be.
And one of the things that I have found is that a lot of the students I work with, and this is something that I talk with when I talk with families and teachers and things like that after I've talked to the student, is there are a lot of the students that I work with who don't actually know whether they're being asked a question or it's just something that somebody's saying to them. Do you know that moment where you, and I get that, like I have that sometimes, where somebody will say something and it sounds like I'm supposed to reply in some kind of way, but I didn't hear it as a question, so I don't quite know what to do next. So that explicit component really involves, there are times where I will say to the kids that I'm with, that's just a comment. There's no question there. Or the question there is, and then I will very specifically lay out the exact question. And then the kids I work with know that they can say to me, I don't understand that. Can you phrase that in a different way? Right? That's a skill that I've taught them. And it's a skill that I've taught myself to be flexible and saying, like, I need to rephrase this in a way they understand. But I think that's part of that explicit point too, is making it clear when you are expecting a response and when you're just saying something. It matters a lot to our students, and it's a simple change you can make too.
Yeah. I think another piece that's so important about the double empathy problem is we have to remove our own emotion from some things and really learn to take what somebody is saying at face value or ask for clarification. Because especially when we're talking about neurodivergent communication, there might be things that come across as very direct, which some people might interpret as rude, when really it is just asking for clarification. If somebody's intending to be rude and we then try to ask for clarification, they're going to continue to be rude. We're going to get that message.
Fair.
But
yes,
if we are just giving them that taking things at face value, oh, this student who is asking me this question is probably very literally asking me this question.
Right.
They're not trying to be rude or defiant or take me off track or whatever it might be. More easily then are we able to move through that and continue on with what we're doing in the classroom. I think sometimes people feel like they lose time if they stop a conversation and try to clarify it, as opposed to treating it as a disciplinary issue or reacting in some different way.
And taking things at face value also takes the responsibility off our neurodivergent students to over-explain. And I am sort of laughing because I know that I do that as an adult, as a neurodivergent adult. I over-explain my thinking. I will give the whole sort of like, well, the reason I'm telling you this is this and blah, 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 blah. And sometimes I don't need to do that. We started this whole conversation saying like, I really like working with you, Emily, because I don't have to take those kinds of steps, right? But even so, sometimes I find myself doing it with you. I find myself doing it with my family, people who know me really well. And they'll say like, I don't need to know all that. Like, I gotcha. I figured it out. And we want to make spaces for our students where they don't feel the need to like explain how they got to the place they are. And I think that's something that I really want to stress is making sure that you're making space where they feel like you're going to follow up with them instead of them having to explain how they got to where they are. Because people should be able to walk into places, students should be able to walk into classrooms and not feel like they have to give the whole backstory. That's a lot of emotional work. It's a lot of cognitive load that if we can just ask clarifying questions and take things at face value, we're removing some of that cognitive load for our students. And by doing that, we're probably also reducing the possibility that they're going to become dysregulated.
We talk so often about self-advocacy with neurodivergent learners. And one thing I always like to ask people to reflect on whenever I'm doing, a presentation or a training or something is, when was the last time you had to self-advocate for something?
Yeah.
That is really hard. It's scary. It's overwhelming. It's anxiety provoking. But when we lay this foundational framework where we are taking the approach of being non-judgmental, of asking clarifying questions, we are allowing students to begin to learn to self-advocate because we're telling them that it's safe to do this and we're opening that door for self-advocacy. We are giving them the opportunity to explain what's going on and we are believing them because I think one of the biggest barriers to self-advocacy is feeling like you're not going to be believed or that it's not going to be viewed as important. And so all of these pieces build on each other to help our students become more independent, become self-advocates, to understand themselves, and to recognize that there are people who they can trust who are going to help them, which sometimes for a lot of our neurodivergent students, they learn the opposite, unfortunately. And that has lifelong impacts.
And it's a powerful thing to be able to believe without having to understand, right? Sometimes you can just believe. It's probably a good time to do our circle back.
Okay. As we circle back, I actually want to start off our circle back by circling back to something we talked about in the introduction, which is about whether or not autistic people experience empathy. And so a couple of different points that I will make about this that are so important for people. First of all, autistic people absolutely experience empathy, but just like any other skill or experience, it varies by individual. Many autistic people show empathy differently. So what that might mean is that because some autistic people, not all, but because some autistic people may have a face that does not have as expressive facial expressions, sounds kind of redundant to say it that way, but that's how I'm going to say it, or their tone of voice may not have as much variance as other people, that can sometimes be interpreted as not being empathetic. Because sometimes neurodivergent people might have a harder time with problem solving, some of that social pragmatic language, that can come across as not empathetic because, well, you're not doing anything, you're not saying the right thing. But that is not the same as not experiencing empathy. The other piece that I will mention about this is that there are two different types of empathy. The first type of empathy is cognitive empathy. So cognitive empathy is the ability to predict what someone else is thinking, to put yourself in their head and anticipate, how they might be perceiving a situation. And that is an area where some autistic people do struggle. I know that I have clients who I work with, and we'll have conversations, and I'll say, well, what do you think that person was thinking in that situation? And they will sit there and they will think for a moment. And I know that they are processing and thinking. And then they will look at me and they will say something like, I literally have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know what that person was thinking. I'm not in their head. And so that's cognitive empathy. The second type of empathy is affective empathy. And affective empathy is about feeling alongside somebody else. So somebody says, I'm feeling really disappointed about this thing, or I had this situation happen. And the neurodivergent person can go, I've felt that way before, or I've experienced that before. And I understand how that feels. And I have this compassion. I have this empathy. I can feel alongside with you. I can have that frustration and that anger that this thing happened. And I might want to take action in order to fix this because it's so unjust. Like those are the types of things that you might see more. But again, just because it looks different doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
I think that's such an important and powerful explanation, because we base empathy and our understanding of empathy on what it looks like for us, right? And I think knowing that it doesn't always look the same for other people is really, really important.
We need to be empathetic about how we interpret other people's empathy.
Whoa, that's so meta. That's a whole other conversation about metacognition, I think.
Yes.
We're not having that conversation right now.
No, but not today.
So when I think about circling back to empathy, I think about the fact that we often think people have it or they don't have it, right? And I want to make sure to say that's just not true, right? There may be some people who have less empathy, and there may be people who are more empathetic, but it's also not clear cut. We can teach students to be more empathetic. We can teach adults to be more empathetic, right? And it's about teaching them, what does it look like to take somebody else's perspective? What does it look like to have your own perspective and know that that can exist in the same space as somebody else's perspective, and that they may not be the same, but because of who you are and your experience, you may experience the situation differently. You may interpret the situation differently. I have done a lot of work around empathy. For some reason, it is, as neurodivergent people have, it is one of those special interests that I have, is the idea of empathy. I wrote a kid's book called What is Empathy? And in the beginning of the book, I have a series of questions and information for parents and educators to have guided conversations with students or their own children about empathy. And then one of the things I did, which I didn't know I was going to do when I started writing the book, was tell the same story from two different perspectives. Because I wanted people to see what empathy looks like in action, right? And I think the other thing I would say is when we are teaching our students about empathy, when we are teaching them what it looks like, what the steps are, especially when we're working with neurodivergent students, it is necessary to take a step back from some of the idiomatic language we use, right? We will often say empathy is taking a walk in somebody else's shoes. It's seeing it through their eyes. And I know so many students who get stuck on that, like, what, I have to walk in their shoes? Like, what is that, right? How do I see through somebody else's eyes? So first of all, know that it can be taught. Second of all, know that how you talk about it matters, right? Taking that idea of clarity and carrying it over in the conversations you have about empathy is incredibly important. When we walk in somebody else's shoes, all we do is know what it feels like to have their shoes on, right?
That's literally what I was thinking about when you said that.
I know. I could see it on your face. Off topic a little bit. I used to have a t-shirt here that says, if you walk a mile in a man's shoes, at least you have his shoes and you're a mile away. That's not a lesson. That's just having shoes and being far away, right? So I would encourage people to really name the steps out loud. You're taking somebody else's perspective. You're putting yours aside for a moment. You're trying to understand that they experience the world differently than you do. And you don't have to agree with them.
So when you're talking about teaching empathy, there's actually a tool that it made me think of that is one of my favorites. And it's not just about teaching empathy. Actually, it's a lot of different concepts related to neurodiversity. And I use this with kids. I use it with adults. But it is this amazing artist who on social media goes by the name NeuroWild. Her actual name is M. Hammond, and I think she lives in New Zealand, right? I think it's New Zealand, not Australia.
I think so. Yeah.
She creates these very cute, adorable cartoons, but they deal very much with all things related to neurodivergence and neurodiversity and explaining it in really accessible ways, both for parents, for educators, for kids. And also, she has one particular cartoon that's about the double empathy problem. And so all of her stuff, in addition to being on social media, if you want to use it professionally, is available on sale on Teachers Pay Teachers. So you can access those and use them in your classroom or during a faculty meeting or whatever it might be. But those are some great tools to just prompt some conversations about all of the things related to neurodivergence. So if you want to teach some of those things, be sure to check that out.
Thanks so much for listening. We are so glad you joined us. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. We'll see you next time.